All right, we're going to get started again. Sorry, guys. So this is a case study discussion about one company's journey from SKUs to using the JD Edwards Configurator. So Medeco is a division of ASSA ABLOY. They make high security locks. And part of, I'm going to zoom in here, part of what they do is they make these locks, and they not only have like a common keys cut like this, and the tumblers, these pins, they go up and down, but with a Medeco lock, it's cut diagonally as well, so the pin has to fall down and then twist to be properly aligned before the lock opens. So they had an old ERP system that was unintegrated with the rest of the company. It was time for replacing that. And they had a SKU-based or stock keeping unit-based ordering process that required a lot of bill of materials set up. They had delays in the custom orders. They came in, most things were custom, and it took engineering a while to set up bills of materials, routings, and such, and we'll go through that. But they also had poor visibility of work order status. So we implemented JD Edwards, including the configurator, and we're going to tell you about that story. So a bit about Medeco's product. I just kind of described how this works, but consider that customers ordered via a catalog, and so there's a catalog even today online, and we'll show you a picture out of that catalog about how people ordered. And what they did was basically pick a model of that lock, and then they had to answer several questions about the lock, including the base part number, basically the model of lock that they wanted, the cylinder type, the finish. Do they want it to be, brass color, gold? Do they want it to be silver? What color do they want the lock? So the finishing metal had to be put on it. The keyway is the little ridges vertically of how does it go in the lock. There's thousands and thousands of different keyways. Does the key even fit into the grooves in the lock? So that's the keyway. The pinning, and also you needed the depth of the lock to fit the thickness of the door. And there were other questions that depended upon the model that you were ordering. So what a customer did traditionally was they were instructed how to build essentially an intelligent part number based on their choices that they're making, and they'd send the order in via EDI, email, and fax. Customer service at Medeco tried to enter the order against the finished good part number to see if it existed, and if it didn't exist, they had to ask engineering to set up a bill of materials. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit to this side. So these are some of the choices. This 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And they basically, out of those questions, they built this intelligent part number. 23 would tell you the model of the lock, what design did you want, what function did it have, the cam position, bevels, number of pins. You get a 3, 4, 5, or 6 pin lock. So there are different choices to make that made up this intelligent part number. And that's how all the orders were done. So there were some inherent problems with that process. There were delays while engineering set up product data. So engineering had to set up a finished good part number if it had never been ordered before, and that happened frequently. They had to create a bill of material of all the parts that went into that, a routing, and then they had to say, is this a valid configuration? Can we even make this lock? Because you could actually pick choices out of the different permutations available where the lock wouldn't even be makeable. It wouldn't function properly. So there were some rules that said, hey, the choices you've made are actually not physically possible to make into a lock, or you wouldn't want to do that. So they also had to determine the costing of that bill of material, and then how much were they going to charge for that unique bill of material. It might be a one-time bill of material. And then it went back to customer service. They had to confirm pricing with the customer. So there are a lot of delays in making the product and fulfilling the order. And as my partner Aubrey says, time is not your friend. And nice little quote in here. He says that all the time. Time is generally not your friend, and he's right. So, however, when we first started the project, the scope, the project charter was to not implement the JD Edwards Configurator. And the original plan was to not try to disrupt the business by implementing the configurator and making this big change in how they went about placing an order for the product. We didn't want to go through the change management impact internally, and particularly with the customers, because the customers, their existing customers, they already knew how to do this. They had the intellectual capital to build that intelligent part number, and they had a lot of catalogs and product that was tagged with the old part numbers. So, and then there's just a lot of effort involved in implementing the JD Edwards Configurator. It's a good, solid product, and we're proponents of it. But you just need to know what you're getting into if you're going to make the leap to the configurator. So part of the purpose of this talk is to properly inform people, at least what this company went through, having no experience with a configurator to implementing the configurator, at least no experience in this division. So the problem with the plan was even if we implemented SKUs, we still had some challenges. We still had to convert hundreds of thousands of item numbers, bills of material, and routings from the old system to JD Edwards. And a lot of the bills of materials were wrong. They were old, hadn't been used in years, maybe decades, and the routings were different. Maybe, they put in more automated lines on the floor to make the product, and some of the old machinery that it referred to in the routing, it just wasn't even correct anymore. So it wasn't like it was just, convert bills and routings from the old system. As we dug into this, we had to not only clean up stuff, but we also had new bills and routings that people would want to create to go live with. So, and with all that work, which wasn't going to be easy, we still had this delay in the business process when a new configuration was ordered, that a bill of material would have to be created. Because they literally, Joel, how many different permutations do you think some of these products
a single product line was probably 500,000 or 600,000 possible permutations of it.
And they had what, 20, 30 product lines?
Yeah, about 20 or 30 product lines.
Yeah. So we're literally millions. Take 500,000 times 20. It had millions of permutations of bills and such. So it took, it was going to take a lot of effort no matter what we did, and we'd still have these problems in delays. So we had to change the plan. And as the project manager, I had to try to gather the data, revise the plan, and go to management and say, you know what, it's worth this effort, but we're going to need a team, and there's going to be some more effort to implement. But once you get live, the process is going to be easier. We're going to describe that process to you. So my job was to get management approval. I worked with Joel to re-estimate the project. We said, okay, we had conversations like we just had. I said, Joel, how many configurations do you think you got to make? And he worked with the business and looked through the catalog and talked to engineering and talked to customer service and manufacturing. And he's like, Craig, I think, we've got to create this many configurations to begin with, based on what we know right now and how we think we're going to use the configurator. But we haven't rolled our sleeves up yet and really dug into it. And we also wondered, what kind of team are we going to need? Who should be on the team? Should we create two teams? And Joel was the configurator expert, so we had to, how are we going to do this and share his expertise maybe across multiple teams to try to do this as fast as possible. So getting to this list of team members, it actually wasn't easy. That was part of the process, is who do we need on the team? And Joel and I had ideas about that, but then we had to convince departments of the business to give these folks up. So Joel was our lead guy with expertise in configurator. He'd implement the configurator in other divisions of ASSA ABLOY, and he was an expert, or is an expert with the product. We were blessed with Paul Taylor. At first, we didn't have Paul, but we added him because he was a former plant manager and he was very hands-on. So he knew how the product was actually made. Because engineering design engineering, they don't really always know how the product is made and the routing that's required to make the metal and machine it and coat it with the finish, that type of thing. They don't always know the physical process. So we needed Paul. Then Ron Brunches was brilliant. He was out of IT, and he knew, Joel, it was always like he knew a lot of stuff. He was also kind of the pricing expert, even though he didn't work in sales, but he redid the price book every year. How would you describe Ron's contributions, Joel?
He started off as a pricing specialist, right? Knowing all the intricacies of how they price their product, how they discount their product. And he knew all of the process in terms of the reports that they run and what it'll look like on the acknowledgement. So instead of going and pinging various areas, we could go to Ron and say, okay, we're gonna create a configuration string, and what is it got to look like on the acknowledgement? And he would know to get the report, get a copy of it. Boom, we'd sit down, we'd start going through it. Yep. Invoice is the same way. So he was very instrumental in tying the whole string of information from the IT perspective, as well as debugging their pricing, because the pricing was very complicated in how they did it, and he was able to take it apart. So
yep. So he was a huge subject matter expert. He was a developer, but we were using his business analyst skills more than anything. And then Brenda was huge key to this. Brenda worked in engineering, and she actually entered into the system the items, the bills, the routings in the old system. So she had the expertise of, okay, what does it look like now? And she helped us enter a lot of the rules that we needed in the configurator, a lot of the base part numbers that the work orders referred to that were on the parts list on the work orders, that type of thing. And then Joel, you feel free to jump in. And then Mark Benzie was the engineer. We actually needed a full-blown engineer. And it says rocket scientist because the funny thing was he was a rocket scientist. He used to work for NASA, and he designed rockets. So it was kind of fun to have literally a rocket scientist on the project. Yeah. So he was a lot of fun. So this team, we actually had these people full-time on the project to create all the information that went into the configurator and the information that the configurator referred to, like items and master routings and things like that, that were really important. So on the right side of the screen says first steps, missteps, rethinking structure as a team learned. So, nobody on here on this team knew the configurator except Joel. And I had set up like accounting for configurator before, but I hadn't worked with the details of it. And as a project manager, to understand what the team was going through, who was needed to get it justified, I had to learn a little bit about the configurator myself. So the education of the team around, Joel knew the configurator, but he didn't know Medeco locks. He knew locks from other divisions, but not Medeco locks. So he had to learn that, as well as how are they made. So understanding how they're designed is one thing. Understanding how they're made is different. And then this whole team had never worked with the JD Edwards Configurator. So as they learned and developed, they would come up with new ideas and new techniques to overcome some of the challenges. Joel, could you elaborate on that a bit?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So it starts off pretty slowly in terms of what the training is involved. So the very first question in any configurator is, what is going to be your base item? And the example I usually give is like, okay, say it's a car. Well, a customer is going to come in. They're buying a Ford, but are they buying a Ford pickup or are they buying a Ford car? And then you start into the other detailed questions. So imagine you're trying to explain that concept. That's how a configurator breaks out to people, and they start grabbing onto pieces of it, right? So they're like, okay, so we want to look at our locks, and our locks have various types of questions as well, like how many pins are going to be in it, what colors are going to be in it. And they start going down an avenue that says, okay, these are the segments that we're going to start to set up for this particular configuration. And the missteps are, as the process goes and they realize they realize, oh, this could be a section as well, or segment in our configurator. Sometimes later in the process, later in the discussion, something that they realize should be a segment will inherently undo something that they've already decided an hour ago, and you got to kind of back and recycle it to keep going forward. So the missteps were, as they learned the more about the configurator, their knowledge of the product started to apply it, and they realized, oh, when an hour ago when we thought we knew X, we should change that because it's no longer really X. We should do it at a different level. We should apply a different rule to get things to work in a different way. Because what they're really building is an artificial intelligence. They're coming up with all the rules that make the product work, and it gives you a routing and a bill of materials. So that learning curve is not a straight line. That is, up and down as you go through. And it's amazing, the team itself, different people contributed different information. Brenda Simmons was the person who put stuff into the system, into their current system. She knew things about how they did it, and she remembered things because every day she was doing this. Mark Benzie was the engineer. He knew how the product worked, but he'd forget how she was putting it in. So he would think about it in grander terms, and she was thinking about it in detailed terms. And then Paul Taylor would be working with Brenda to talk about, well, we need a routing to go with it. So how does it work in the factory? How should we create routing steps, et cetera? And Ron was tying the whole thing together with, well, don't forget this report we run, and we break it out in such a way that we need to consider having access to those values to make this particular report work. So the team went through this process of going back and forth, and sometimes we went backwards and sometimes we went forward. Most of the time we kept moving forward, but it was not just like, okay, start from point A and go to point B. It was more like halfway to A, circle back, go, and we would more like a whirlwind circling its way down the timeline.
Yep.
So there was a lot of it.
It was somewhat of an organic process, and sometimes I had to come and say, Craig, it's going to take an extra month because we got to redo this. We've learned that that's the way we were going to do it. It wasn't going to work. We got to do it this way. Plus, it'll have this advantage. And I'm like, you sure? And I had to go back to management and say, all right, it's going to be a little longer, but we're going to have this benefit. And so there's a lot of communication. Even the physical space that we had, the team ended up around really one large table in a project team room, a work session room. And we put up, what was it, like a 50, 60-inch monitor? Because a lot of times they had to put up data in front of everybody and say, hey, this is what I'm working on. This is the question I have. And there was talk sometimes like between Paul and Mark, like how do you make this, Paul? How is this done on the floor? Sometimes Paul would know, sometimes he'd go down the floor and research it and come back with the answer so he could build the routing right, that type of thing. Let alone maybe we can build the parts list and the routing correctly that comes out of this thing, but how does that relate to pricing it? Do we want to charge more? And sometimes we'd get into discussions like, when we're using this kind of finish, we should really charge this much more, and we don't today. So we don't have time. We didn't think about it. Really, if we're having to use 6 pins versus 3 pins, maybe we should charge more for that because there's more machining, there's more metal that goes into it. So there was a lot of re-engineering of not just engineering data, but pricing data. And
as you mentioned, they were educating themselves in part of the process, right? When they broke it down into the individual pieces, they found problems with their existing SKUs. They realized, as pricing being an example, they realized we're underpricing this. No way it should have gone out that way because there's these additional features in that. So we tried to correct those things as we discovered them going forward, saying, okay, now because we're breaking it up into pieces, we'll make sure the individual pieces are right, and they in their sum total will add up to be the right value. So it was part of that. Part of that was like, they started off saying every part we have set up is perfect, and like 2 weeks into it, they're like, well, okay, so maybe it's not perfect.
Yeah, we actually use more metal than that. There would be things like that would go into it. So we're not trying to scare you, just saying it was a bit organic how it happened. So we thought we'd give a few slides here on, so how does the configurator work? And you're not going to know how to go set the configurator out of this. This is more of a case study journey, description of the journey, but we wanted to give you some idea how this thing works. So on the left, what's the order flow? So you start putting a sales order in. This is after how you set it up. And we would always say if you used an item number that was defined as a configured item, it would pop the configurator. And it's a line type W, if you know what that means. It's going to create a work order for that sales order line, and it would basically pop the configurator, and we'll show you what that looks like. And on the configuration screen, you enter the choices. Do I want it to be blue or red? Do I want it, is the lock this thick? You're basically making choices about the product. And your product, I'm sure, isn't locks, but if you have to a limited number of choices, a finite number, I should say, not limited, but because sometimes the number of choices is big. But if it's a finite number of choices, you enter those choices on a screen, and then the configurator figures out the price if you have pricing rules, and we did. It figures the cost out, and it generates a manufacturing work order because it's a line type W. But on that unique work order for that lock being ordered, or whatever configuration, whatever your product is, it generates on that work order. If you're familiar with the manufacturing work order, it has a parts list. It says these are the materials that I'm going to consume to make this lock. This much metal, this much finish goes into the lock, and there were different types of metals that would go into a lock. The routing, what physical equipment and work centers on the manufacturing floor does the product have to go to, and how much machine overhead, basically, and labor is required to make that lock. So we put in labor and machine time on the routing, but the configurator, like Joel said, it's like artificial intelligence. It's dynamically building that list of parts, and it's dynamically building that routing based on the choices that are made on the configurator screen. And what comes out of that, you don't need a finished good item number anymore. I'm going to back up to this configurator string. You don't need a finished good item number anymore. You don't need a bill. You don't need a routing. And because you don't need a person to come up with those, that you have this little AI engine, you don't have these delays anymore. So it would generate a unique configured string. It's kind of like a one-time bill of material, but it's not a bill of material per se. So that configured string, and actually if someone ordered it again, and for some reason the configurator has this feature, if it's in stock because maybe the customer changes their mind, it'll actually tell you, hey, I've got one of those, that same exact configuration. You can set it up to do that. We didn't need that, but that is a feature of the configurator. So trying to get the manual cost and pricing, we basically didn't have to do this anymore, so we're also getting rid of the delays is the point down here. So I thought this picture of the kid trying to figure something out was kind of appropriate because it has a lot to it, and we're just not even scratching the surface. We're just showing you the surface of what it looks like. So this is the configurator screen. So once you enter a sales order line and it has you use a configured part number, it's going to pop this screen up. And I'm going to zoom in a little bit so you have a better chance of seeing it. So the choices are down here. So this is not an example for a lock. This is out of the JD Edwards demo database. Out of your pristine database, it would have this. It's a forklift. So it'd say, I'm ordering a model forklift 6000. And what kind of forks do you want on it? What kind of capacity should it have? The heavy duty forklift or forks on it, or the medium duty or the light duty? How many pounds capacity? That tells us how much metal, how much machining is required, the boom height, the power type. If I want it to be propane, you can't see the answers under here, but you can choose propane or electric. If I say, and that's one of the features of the configurator, based on the answers that you're giving, it can change the choices that's called the dynamic configurator. And so if you say it's propane, it'll say, well, how big a tank do you want? And then choose the paint color, the type of interior you want, what's the counterweight. There's a counterweight on a forklift, so you can pick up something heavy and it won't tip over. And then do you want a spare fork? So you can make some of these choices required or optional. And there's also calculated fields that are coming here, but this is saying, hey, we have a valid configuration. It's priced it out at a $29,000 forklift with a $28,000 cost, so we've got a thin margin on this, and it calculated the weight. Some of there's there's calculations you can perform, but we know what the weight is for shipping, and that can be really important for the customer. Anything you'd add here, Joel? Sorry, I just kind of rambled on.
Yeah, just simply that what you're seeing the output of all the rules that get created. So when you look at the screen, you'll see the numbers to the left-hand side. Those are your segment numbers. So the users, after they're trained, create the segments that make up this product. So an example of the forklift, they sat down and decided we're going to have a question or a segment that asks about the rating. We're going to have one about the boom, about the power type, etc. They set all this stuff up. So JD Edwards gives you basically a platform where you create the rules that is the artificial intelligence that you're going to use to make configuration. So it sounds like rocket science, and we had a rocket scientist involved in it, but it really isn't rocket science, right? It's just knowing your product well enough to be able to ask these questions and behind the scenes drive the results of you answering these questions, right? They have things called cross-segment adding rules that say if you have something in segment 10, and a different value in segment 35, well, those two can't jive, right? But that's a rule that you guys create. That the people who who manage the product, they develop that rule to say, yes, in this condition, they can't go together. So all the rules behind there are created by the users of the system. And the education is going from, well, we used to just create a part number to breaking it down into the various pieces so you can write those rules to allow you to create the configuration. So what you're seeing is the output behind the scenes is sophisticated, but not complicated. When you see the rules, they're not very complicated.
Yep. And I had said you choose the calculated counterweight, but that's wrong. This is actually a calculated field. Based on all the choices you're making, it's calculating how big the counterweight should be.
Right.
So different, features inside the software. So once you fill out all these answers, what happens is you get a work order. And the work order has a parts list. So I'm going to zoom in on this one a little bit here so you can see. So now it's created a specific work order 452306, it looks like, for this forklift. And it says, okay, I need one boom, I need one chassis, I need a gas engine, I need 4 tires, I need one 10-foot boom based on a choice that was made. I need yellow paint because I chose yellow, and I got to have this much in counterweights. So it calculated a parts list, and of course there's a cost for those parts. So it's calculating the material cost based on the choices. Anything to add, Joel?
No.
Okay. And then you also get the routing. So it generates on that same work order a routing that's calculated. It says it's got to go through these work centers to attach the boom, mount the power, add the counterweights, paint it yellow, and apply a clear coat. So we can have costs associated with those work centers, and we have so many machine run hours and labor hours associated with that. So now it's built out the material, labor, and overhead costs.
An interesting part about the routing is there's basically 2 ways to go about creating the rules for a routing. You can take a part like, say, 6100, the forklift, and put all the possible routing steps that you could ever have on a configuration into the routing rules for the 6100. What Medeco did, which was quite interesting, is they decided to create those routing rules as separate parts that they could pull in from the routing rule, but pull it in by part number. And the reason why they did that is so that, say they have a painting or a plating operation, and the 6100 is only one of the hundreds of configured parts that use that operation, they can manage the details of that process, that operation, independent of going into each one of the configurations that use it, right? So say they had a 6100, which is a small forklift, then they had a 6200, which is a medium-sized forklift, 6300 was a bigger forklift, but all of them went through some kind of painting process. They would create a part number called, painting the forklift, and everybody would use it. And the painting was roughly the same on all 3, so they would use it. So in the future, if they came up with a more modern way of doing painting, they could go to this one part, change it, and it would affect the configurations across the board, as opposed to going into each one of the parts and finding the painting operations and changing them. So it's a different perspective as to how to manage the data to get you a very slick result that takes less maintenance going forward.
Thanks, Joel. That's good.
Yeah.
Okay, so at one point in the project, I'd say that we definitely hit our stride. We started gaining efficiencies. We actually started beating estimate because we had a lot of things figured out. One of the things that we had to figure out was not all the configurations are frequently ordered. You know, do we do the whole catalog? And because I said to management, you know, if we do the whole catalog, it's going to take this long. If we do the part of the catalog that's ordered most frequently, you know, it'll take half as long. So we gave them a choice of, you know, how much do you want us to complete before we go live? Because you can keep creating the configurator rules after you go live and go after the configurations that are less frequently ordered. Because everybody knows that sometimes you have things in your catalog, they might be there for a reason, they're profitable, but they're not ordered that often. You might just get, you know, an order every 6 months for that configuration, so why do it? So there's always a paint configuration or something, or even a base model that's just not ordered very often, and we didn't want to delay the project because of that. We ended up figuring out a pretty, what I would call a standard repeatable process to gather the engineering data, to clean it up, and say, is this any good? We knew how to do that. We knew who should make the call, who should approve it. We got a system going. And we determined all these rules, the parts rules, the routing rules, the pricing rules, and there were a lot of different calculations. The costs really are driven, Joel, from the parts and the routing, correct?
Yes.
And then the cross-segment editing rules, I'll let Joel describe what those are, as well as maybe some other calculations, Joel, to give folks a feel for that.
Sure. A calculation, as an example, we saw the weight, the counterweight being determined. So you didn't have to bother to select them. A calculation will take the inputs from the other segments and generate a result that goes into a different segment. So the weight counterweight on the forklift was a perfect example of that. Cross-segment editing rules are for, if you created a routing and you said, here are my 12 colors and here are my 5 sizes, you would assume that they would all go together. But there are probably conditions that say, well, this size, it's not allowed to have this color. So a cross-segment editing rules takes two different answers and says, okay, this combination is not valid, and throws a warning message or throws an error message saying, okay, you can't do that. So it helps to shrink the pile for things that are not possible. When we went to at Medeco, they have a catalog that has, you know, like I said, probably 50 different product lines. And we went live, we worked on which sections. Before we went live, we were working on the most popular product lines and left the lower volume product lines towards the end of it, which actually spilled over into after go live. There were some product lines we're still doing as SKUs. Most of the stuff was coming through as configurator, and over time they worked out the last bit of them.
Thanks, Joel. That's good. So one of the little side projects that came out related to configurator was a lot of the orders were taken via EDI, and so we had to figure out EDI doesn't really have a configured string setup, right? It's more, here's an item. So this was a blessing and a curse. We were actually able to let all the customers keep ordering under the intelligent part number process that we're doing it via the EDI. But what we had to do was basically create a cross-reference index to a configured string. And Joel was the surgeon, the brain surgeon that figured out how to do this. And we had a lot of different team members help with that. But Joel was instrumental, and we could do a whole nother session on the process that he created. It was pretty cool. And this meant that there were no change for existing customers. So the change management disruption that happened was more just internal to Medeco, and we didn't have to go out and re-educate existing customers. And it gave us the option for new customers to let them order from a more configured approach, like on a website. to be able to make the configurator choices on a website. So we ended up knowing also how to estimate the work. So at first, our estimates they weren't as accurate as they needed to be, but then we got a good benchmark schedule established. So how long did it take? The original estimate was about 3 months to do it, but that didn't include a lot of things that we learned, a lot of cleaning and cleansing. But as we got the team fully up to speed, first of all, we had to get a team, to get management to give us the people to do the work, and then get that team up the learning curve and hitting their stride. Ended up taking about 9 months. So it definitely took a little bit longer than planned. And part of the time for this client was that they didn't have any experience with a configurator. There was a couple people new that I used, like an SAP configurator, some other Oracle e-business suite configurator, but they had never used, most of the people had never worked with anything like a configurator. So we had to get them trained and up to speed on what does it even do? What's possible? How should we use it here? So we've done other projects that we actually did one where someone was using a configurator that was going obsolete, and they already had the configuration data. It was current. They understood the concept of a configurator. We actually estimated to just do 4 part numbers in 3 months, but we actually did 26 part numbers in 3 months. So we actually beat estimate on that. But the organization, the client, had experience with a configurator. They had a one that was actually being used every day. So it was more moving and migrating. We couldn't convert it mechanically, but we were able to set it up pretty quick. So it doesn't always take longer than you think. Depends on the situation. So what were the results? We moved the organization from an engineer to order model to a configure to order model for their primary product. There was accessories and other things that weren't engineer to order. They were make to stock, but we had to move them from engineer to order, which was a lot more resource intensive and a lot more expertise involved, to more of a artificial intelligence process of ordering, where it's like ordering a pizza. Give us your choices. How many toppings do you want? What crust do you want? What sauce do you want? We're done. Here's your pizza. So about 90% of the orders are taken now without any delays to create the product data. The order can go right to manufacturing the same day with a custom parts list and routing, and basically instructions on how to make it. So we reduce the cumulative manufacturing lead time to the customer significantly. There weren't any delays longer waiting for engineering the backlog to clear for something to make it through the backlog. We didn't have that. That was gone. They could take an order and boom, they could drop that order down and start making it the same day if they had capacity, of course. So the strategic competitive advantage for Medeco was gained, and that they shortened their manufacturing lead time significantly. So, is your business a candidate for the JD Edwards Configurator? These are the different considerations that Joel and I look for when saying, is there an opportunity to reduce lead time, to improve things by using the configurator? The first indication usually, do you have a product catalog and lay out the product choices for the customers to make? Is it a car? Is it a pizza? Is it a forklift? Is it a lock where there's a finite number of choices to make, and it's not an infinite number, and there's not 270 things to design about it, and it's repeatable. So if there's a catalog, that's often an indication. And another indication is someone says, you know what, we have 3.2 million bills of material, and most of them they're used once and they're never used again. That's an indication that you need a configurator, because you have lots and lots and lots of one-time bills. And is there a finite number of choices to make on a given product model? So, if you've got, this is kind of an example on the right here. So if you've got 5 choices for length, 4 choices for width, you got 26 color choices, you have a gauge or thickness of the material, you got 10 choices, you got whatever, another 10 choices, that right there, that's 52,000 combinations. So you can see that, if you end up with, Medeco had like 25 different product lines, and they had 500,000 combinations per product line. So you never want to create all those bills of material, but the configurator can do them on the fly consistently. It's like, what kind of pizza is being ordered. So, you're not making pizza, I'm sure, but if you're making something with a finite number of choices, you might be a good candidate for the configurator.
And Medeco was, their story is they knew they had 500,000 possible combinations. And so they didn't set up the bills of material or even create the items because it would take them too long to create 500,000 parts with the 500,000 bills and the 500,000 routings. So that's why they were creating them as orders were coming in. They knew all the possibilities. They just didn't have the time to set them up. And in 9 months, we set up Configurator enough to cover 70% of their order taking. So instead of engineers spending time maintaining existing product lines, we were able to do the configuration and take them out of that business so that the configurator itself would generate the new possibilities and cover the 500,000. So it's not like these guys are just behind the times. They looked at it and made a strategic decision saying, we can't afford to put that much engineering time into creating 500,000 for one product line, create 500,000 parts, bills, and routings. And so they would pay the price on order entry. Oh, we got a new one, never entered this one. It would go away for 4 or 5 days. And an engineer that was working on a new product would have to come off of that to help support this product so they could get the order through. By giving them the configurator, that problem went away. They were taking in orders that they'd never seen before, and they were happily going out to the factory and being produced and being shipped out.
So it was a big success story for Medeco. They really enjoyed having that. So questions and answers. There's the Q&A tab in this tool, this online meeting tool we're using. I just put a simple question out there. Be glad to answer any questions that you have. Or if you want, do you need help determining if your company is a good candidate for this? Give a few minutes here give a minute for folks to ask questions. Okay, not seeing any. Okay. Eventually you will have a price increase from Bill, from William. Can you set up selling price rules with effective dates in the configurator? I believe so. Joe?
Oh, absolutely. Those are called X rules. And that's exactly how Medeco did it. They had their prices built into their X rules. So they would actually do the pricing based on features. And we've done this, I've done this in several companies where, okay, the color adds $10, the length adds $5, and they would actually build up their pricing. So when they wanted to go, they would literally say, why are we raising the price? Well, we're raising the price for whatever reason. You want to put it into the function. They would go into those one specific attribute and change them, and that would change the prices automatically. So there was actually less maintenance than what they were used to. Instead of going to, say they had 6,000 part numbers, which wasn't actually everything they could have made, but those are what they had made in the past. They would have to update 6,000 records with new prices. Here, they were able to do it by changing the rules and outdate. And basically, they did that. They would out effective the old one, so that price would be good through the end of the year. And before the end of the year, they would set up a new rule that began on January 1st, 2021, and ended on 12/31/2021, or however long they wanted to go. And they would put those rules in effect. So they would enter orders on, New Year's Eve, and it'd be one price, and on New Year's Day, it'd be a different price. And all of that was set up a month in advance. Hopefully that answers your question.
Thanks, Joel.
Yep.
I think it did. Other questions? What other questions do you have?
The configuration takes a paradigm shift in how you look at your product. And that's part of the education. So for Medeco, that was part of their education. They were used to setting up SKUs, and so they would say, what's the combination? They would write it down, and they would go and build the bill of material. We took that and said, okay, break those up into individual pieces, create rules that combine those things, and build them on the fly. So it was a very interesting process for them as well as for us in terms of transferring that knowledge and watching them make connecting the dots and realizing, oh, we could do this and we could do this, and it was exciting. So it started slow, but it finished. At the end, there were 5 very qualified people who knew a lot about how to set up a configurator.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Joel. It doesn't look like any more questions have come in. I'll go to the end, and please submit your evaluation. That's usually a standard process. The session ID is 101400. This is my email address, craig.hill@catechnology.com, and my phone number. Please get a hold of us. Come visit our booth, virtual booth, and thank you for your time. And I hope this session was edifying for you. Thank you, Joel, for presenting with me.
Thanks everyone for participating.
Okay. Have a good day.